And we're live, I think. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the commentary of The Witch on Halloween night, featuring myself, Atun-Shei Films. This is my channel. You probably know who I am. With very special guest, Dr. Justin Sledge of the channel Esoterica. Give him a big round of applause, everybody.
Hi, folks.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to hanging out with you and hanging out, talking about witchcraft, talking about this great movie, and yeah, just hanging out. It's great. What better way to spend a Halloween night?
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, I definitely appreciate having you, and yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a great as well. So you have this channel Esoterica, which is an awesome goldmine of everything of Western occultism, of sort of biblical magic, early modern witchcraft, sort of all of the above. You're this close to 100,000 subscribers, which, as we all know, is the only YouTube milestone that actually matters because you get something in the mail. So
I've heard.
Yes. Yeah, so if all of you guys watching, please, let's see if we can bump Justin up to 100,000. That'd be pretty cool. And yeah, so basically what we're going to be doing tonight is, as the title suggests, we're going to be watching The Witch, which is the 2015 Robert Eggers movie. One of, I think, very critically acclaimed, and I think pretty much well regarded as, one of the best horror movies of, the past decade, if not, the 21st century. It really is a sort of a modern classic. And yeah, basically we're going to be watching it along with you guys, starting the movie at 8. If you're watching this after the fact, if this is going to remain on my channel, so if you're watching it in the future, you should, I'll probably put some timestamps in the description that will say, here's when the movie's starting. And we're basically going to start it right where right when the A24 logo comes up onto the screen, right? So yeah, I would say to everybody in the chat, if you want to do this with us, start getting set up now. We are going to start the movie at 8 o'clock Central Time sharp. So yeah, it is available for rent on Amazon Prime for like $4 as of this recording. There's also, I think, if you sign up for like the Showtime free trial, you can watch it for free. And then you could probably also just cancel the free trial tonight if if you wanted to be sneaky. So yeah, it's out there. It's available. Get yourself set up and be ready at 8. But listen, Justin. So what are your thoughts about Robert Eggers and about his movies and sort of how did you kind of come to The Witch and his work and how do you think it sort of measures up as an expert in this stuff? How did he do a good job?
Yeah, it's sort of. So I obviously came at it from a person who has an academic background studying things like witchcraft, and I have a longstanding interest in witchcraft and witch hunting and these sort of demonological manuals, which make for really not cheery reading when you read, the 50th page on how to torture people to get them to confess to, to being in league with the devil or whatever.
Yeah.
So I came at it from that angle, and so I'm always interested in how witches, witchcraft, witch hunting, which you know something about, how things like that get depicted in media. And on the one hand, I'm really interested in how this witch idea survived. It's amazing that what is called the elaborated theory of witchcraft, which we can talk about later as the film as it goes, and Eggers certainly has his finger on the pulse of the elaborated theory of witchcraft. How this idea has just stuck for hundreds of years, and how it's stuck with so little change, right? You're still, in 2015, you can still see, images of women in the woods boiling babies to make flying ointment or whatever. And just reaching back to medieval or early modern demonological and witch hunting manuals, just seeing how that theory got developed. And that, to me, is really fascinating. Mostly because we can't find any evidence of there actually being any witches. This is the thing that often blows people's minds, is that, and this is where I think that the movie is an interesting take, because he describes it, I think, as a folk tale, a New England folk tale, or something like a New England fairy tale, where it's great because it doesn't have to really be true. There were never any witches in the woods around, Hartford, Connecticut, or Salem or whatever. They lived in the minds of witch hunters, basically. And so what's interesting is that I think we're seeing the movie through the eyes of a person who would have lived at the time.
Yeah.
As opposed to creating historical account of what things like witches and witch hunting and witchcraft would have looked like.
Yeah.
Which I still say that hasn't really been done in film. I think we were talking about this before we got onto the live chat, is that I would really love to see a movie about some of the early skeptics, which skepticism about which the witch hunts were already beginning by the time this movie takes place in the 1630s. People like Johann Weyer and folks like that. I would love to, even Winthrop Jr., the governor of Connecticut, was pretty skeptical about the existence of witches and witchcraft, despite the fact that there was a witch trial going on during his administration. So I'd just really be interested to see a movie that took seriously the debate between not just the witch hunters, but the minority position that had emerged, but we now recognize to being right, as the skeptics who are like, I don't think that there are witches. I think that this is just torturing a bunch of mentally ill and poor women into confessing things. And I would find that to be a super fascinating movie. But what's great about this film is how well researched it is almost at every level. And this is literally what worried the witch hunters. And I think it's in terms of that, they would have used this movie as evidence in the trials if they could have.
Yeah, exactly.
They'd have been like, look, that's what's going on in the forest outside of whatever, you know. And so I think
we're in Framingham, Massachusetts, where the Shoppers World stands today. No, but anyway, it definitely. Well, I think Robert Eggers has described it as like a Puritan having a nightmare, right? And I was watching to prepare for this stream. I was watching a lot of interviews with him on YouTube, and he seems like an interesting guy. He definitely. I kind of love how little patience he has for kind of the Hollywood type interviewers who are like, hey, you know, your spooky movie is like, it scared the pants off of me. And he's just like, okay, you know, it's just like, this has been called like, you know, the techno psycho thriller, you know, or whatever. And everybody's trying to be kind of clever with him. He's like, if you want to call it that, I guess, you know, it just seems he's very much not in that world.
Can we get to talking about, 17th century accents? That's what I'm really here for.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it is interesting because a lot of what he sort of says that he's into, I mean, I was watching an interview with him where he said that he was more into the occult and folk tales and fairy tales and magic and religion than he was in movies. And he basically sort of said that if he would rather, you know, paint a painting or write a novel about folklore just his interests and the occult than he would make a movie about just something else. You know what I mean? Right. And that's sort of his main interest, which I think is really interesting and really kind of comes through in a big way. And I think you're totally right, Justin, about that. About how it really kind of showcases that perspective of witches are absolutely real. And I mean, you know, as we'll all see, you know, and this isn't too much of a spoiler, which, you know, you should not be watching this for the first time with us. Watch the movie, then come back. Yeah. But it's like there's, you know, we know within the first 10 minutes of the movie, we see a witch, right? You know, grinding up a baby. That's, you know, it's like, this is real, this is happening, you know, and it is and it is a problem, you know, that the godly commonwealth must deal with. And it's the skeptics are really interesting. I don't know, Justin, if you saw my In Defense of Puritanism, that video where it talks about where it talks about Robert Califf, who wrote More Wonders of the Invisible World, like a YouTube reacting, you know, a YouTuber, you know, said taking down another YouTuber with facts and logic. He writes a book in response to Cotton Mather's book, Wonders of the Invisible World, which is all about sort of witchcraft, sort of in the amidst of Salem, and saying, you know, we're gonna there is an invisible world and there's horrors within it, and God is allowing the devil to present us with these challenges as he tested Job, right? And so he's basically kind of making the argument of, you know, these sort of central tenets of the elaborated theory of witchcraft in the Puritan way. And then Robert Califf in 1700 writes More Wonders of the Invisible World, which it's like, this is like YouTube titles, you know, it's sort of the play on Cotton Mather's title. And where he argues, you know, very convincingly that this is all overblown, that this is all nonsense, and that it doesn't stand up to logical or biblical scrutiny. But of course, that Robert Califf was a very late skeptic, you know, because obviously in 1700, you know, the witch hunting craze was, you know, finished. But even so, I mean, there are some there really are some fascinating texts out there by the skeptics, basically just saying this is nonsense. It's not. There's no evidence for this.
No, right, and even
Yeah.
I think even in many ways even more interesting than just that it's nonsense. They are also some of the earliest elaborators of things like concept of mental illness. That they're saying these
Yeah.
women are suffering from melancholy, which is a basically a catch-all term for something, or enthusiasm, which are all both catch-all terms for mental illness. And so it's really fascinating for them, and some of these guys were hunters that are flipped, and I think that's incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
And so, I find that the skeptics to be really fascinating, but also the other guys like Glanville's, his Sadducimus Triumphastus, which has to be the best title of a book ever, Sadducism Triumphant. But he says basically you can't believe in Christianity unless you believe in all this. The demons are the proof of Christianity. That the malevolent forces of all this is actually proof. And of course, for Malleus Maleficarum, which I bring along my copy of Malleus. I have a copy here of Malleus Maleficarum from 1574. This is the first Venice printing, and the first Venice printing. So it's the first printing of the second wave of Malleus. But one of my favorite things about this volume that I have is that this was owned by a witch hunter. There's no doubt about it, because he has his notes left in the book. And one of the notes that he has in the book, right, is that when he underlines, he doesn't underline a lot, but one of the things he underlines here in this copy of Malleus is at the very beginning, where it says basically it's impossible to be Catholic and not believe in witches. That the witchcraft is proof of God, and that the very presence of the devil demands that you believe in God, which is, I think, the same kind of proof that they give in From Dusk Till Dawn. If there are vampires, and there must be. Exactly. It's funny where that proof shows back up. Harvey Keitel and Asturias from this. So I also just find that how Christianity was willing to latch itself to that horse. That they were like, the easiest miracles we have access to are demons, and even though they're bad miracles, that witches can fly around is proof that there must be a God.
Yeah.
And you can't be Catholic. You can't be Catholic. You can't be Christian unless you believe this.
Well, and also, sort of the literal sort of interpretation of the Word of God, of the Bible, sort of, necessitates a belief in witchcraft. It's multiple references in the Bible. I think I talked about it in some Witchfinder General video. I think it might have been the Witchfinder General versus the mainstream media, which where he basically listed off. He was like, look, there is the Bible tells us of the sorcerers of Egypt and of Babylon and of Persia, and if God, or if witches didn't exist, then why would God give us commandments about how to deal with them? And
the Bible's
so it's
also
kind of
the Bible's frighteningly clear, right? The Hebrew, machashefa lo techeye is what it says in Hebrew. For machashefa, a witch, she cannot live. Which is interesting, by the way, because we're not really quite sure what machashefa actually means. The Hebrew words there is rather mysterious. And so when they translated that to Greek, they translated it as pharmakus, poisoner. And so the image of the witch as poisoner also become a thing that you see this gets kicked up. So it's just the whole history of this witch business is just it's a mess. But it's a wonderful mess, because I don't have to deal with the consequences of being killed for it. Or I'm glad that it's a mess from 300 years ago or whatever. But it is a fascinating mess.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's 7:59, and we're about it is about that time. So just I want to say, everybody, last call. If you're going to watch the movie with us, get it set up. Throw it up on your TV and have this open on the couch next to you, and it'll be like we're in the room with you. So get that going, and we've got it pulled up on our respective ends, and I think we'll just sort of press play at the same time, Justin.
All right,
and hope for the best, even if it's a little out of sync. If we're not, we've both got our headphones in. It's not, it'd be effectively the same scene that we're watching. So in any case, I thank you. Actually, real quick before we start, I saw there were a couple super chats. Thank you guys so much. I apologize that I missed them. I don't think I saw any questions there though, but please keep them coming. I really, really, truly appreciate that. And we are going to be sort of in the midst of our conversation kind of between us, but certainly if you have questions, I'll certainly love to to field them. And why don't we get this show on the road, Justin? All right, everybody, you ready? We're about to play the film. The film. The lights are going down. The theater's starting. All right, let's rock and frickin' roll. All right, Justin, I am pressing play.
All right. A24. I hear good things about these guys.
Oh yeah, A24. I mean, it's I mean, pretty much if you want to make a weird, creepy, disgusting horror movie, A24 is the
people. Yeah, I need to reach out to these people. I got some ideas. And you and I can work together. I have
Justin. Nothing would please me more. I would love that. That'd be really awesome. Real quick. I got $100 super chat. Zada, wow. Thank you so much. I think you're a patron of mine. If I recognize your logo, would love it even more if this were a weekly thing, not Sundays. I know the Lord's Day. It is. I am breaking a commandment. But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely going to live stream more, everyone. I'm definitely going to make it a bit more of a priority just to get you more regular stuff to watch. But yeah, thank you so much. It won't be weekly, but maybe monthly. So yeah, I love the font that they use, the sort of early modern sort of typeface.
Yeah, go cheap. Why use the W when you can just double the V, baby?
Yeah, I made I tweeted about that not too long ago, sort of saying that I feel like if and when I go into the pit for all of my sins and crimes, my punishment that the devil will lay on me is having to explain to my film school friends that the movie is not called The Witch, it's called The Witch, and that's just was cheaper.
It's not Ye Old Inn. It's actually just The Old Inn.
Yeah, The Old Inn. Exactly.
Yeah.
So this scene is really cool. Again, Robert Eggers being a huge nerd, taking dialogue straight from period sources. There's a lot here from the Anne Hutchinson trial in 1637.
Right.
And in fact, the line that the magistrate says here in the meeting house, it says something like, "You're banished from the liberties of this plantation." There it is. From this plantation's liberties. That comes up almost word for word in the trial of Anne Hutchinson, when Governor John Winthrop says that, let's see, it's be the mind of the cart that she shall be banished out of our liberties and imprisoned till she be sent away. And all those who are in favor, let them hold up their hands. When Anne Hutchinson, of course, was a heretical Puritan woman who was accused of preaching and of kind of doing the man's job of preaching, which is expressly forbidden in the Bible. So,
and I think these sequences here are filmed at Plymouth Plantation, right?
Yes, they totally are.
That's a really great place for folks to go. I also say that they have a really amazing Wampanoag village right next to Plymouth Plantation. That's also really cool. They have both a summer village and a winter village, both Massasoit or Wampanoag. I can't remember, but maybe both.
Yeah. So the they do have the Wampanoag village there, and actually some of those guys in the extras in those scenes are kind of familiar faces because there aren't that many Wampanoag actors, and actually Anawan Whedon is one of the native guys in that shot, who's
really cool.
A fairly famous sort of locally kind of renowned historian and tribal historian and actor and basically lecturer who talks about sort of Wampanoag culture and stuff, and he's sort of a public speaker and everything. Chris H, thank you so much for that donation. Wow, that's incredibly generous.
I love how these shots just all look like Dutch. They could all be Dutch paintings at some level. Like the stern faces of all the Puritans standing there. They have this the composition of those kinds of shots all look like they could be Vermeers or some Dutch master could have painted them even.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the way that Robert Eggers uses firelight and candlelight is very reminiscent of all of those wonderful Baroque paintings, which I realized is the most pretentious film school sentence that I have ever uttered, and I have uttered many of them in my day.
And I think also another thing about this, I guess, the two things that the sound work in this film is also just mind-bogglingly creepy and well done.
And the
and also I
score.
think,
Yeah.
and I also will say that not to downplay just how terrifying it would have been to have been exiled at this time. Like these people
Mm.
were living on the moon at some level,
Yeah.
and to go into actual exile, to have to build a farmstead on your own, this is a really nightmarish scenario.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It definitely is. And yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about the sort of the inspiration that Robert Eggers had with this movie is that he really wanted to sort of utilize the woods as kind of this creepy force,
Mhm.
and just and many of the characters talk about it, you know, and obviously it's sort of spelled right out, you know, spelled right out for you when that shot, where the crane shot, where it sort of moves into the woods, and you hear the it's like
Right.
the wilderness is a scary place, the wilderness is a horrifying place, the wilderness is where the devil lives,
No,
and
right, right.
obviously that is that completely tracks with the Puritan worldview,
Of
which I've
course.
talked about in videos and stuff. And it is kind of interesting that we do that. Sort of, I feel like the biggest sort of, I guess, force in this time that's kind of missing from this movie are Native Americans. You know, that it is
Right.
kind of like that the only two Native people that we see in this movie are those two Wampanoag guys in Plymouth Plantation at the very beginning.
Right. And I think that's meant to reinforce just how
But that's
alone they
fitting.
are. Right. That they're
Yeah, exactly.
that
But and I was
not
going to say
even the
that
Native
it's
Americans
fitting.
want to be
Yeah.
near here. They know better.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But also, you know, in the Puritan mind, there was, you know, the idea of Satan and of Native Americans was essentially inseparable. You
Right.
know, that
Yeah.
they were sort of agents of the devil, and you know, they sort of, this is what happens when the devil is allowed to reign. Sort of, you know, in the devil's country, these are the sorts of people who, you know, who live here. You know.
Right.
Let me see
It's
if
just interesting also seeing Anya Taylor-Joy so young. I keep
I
expecting her to
know.
be just like swilling some booze and doing a line of coke and playing chess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like where's the chessboard?
So this scene with where Sam the baby disappears. I mean, this is what, when I first saw the trailer way back in the day when this movie came out, this is sort of what immediately grabbed me. There's just something very chilling about that image.
No, for sure, and especially, you know, I have a couple young kids, and yeah, the image of
Oh God, yeah.
them going missing. Yeah, and again, this is the classic. Again, we talked earlier about the elaborated theory of witchcraft, which is what scholars refer to as the general theory of what witch hunters and inquisitors and demonologists thought witches were up to. And of course, this is the most classic image of the witch stealing a baby. Although typically the baby has to be unbaptized, which is in most of the theories, the baby has to be unbaptized to be able to be, you know, killed in order to make a flying potion or what have you.
Yeah, you know, I think Ralph Ineson and Kate Dickey's characters talk about that later on, and I actually wanted to talk to you about that, Justin. That occurred to me when I was watching this to get ready for our stream. I think they do say at some point, you know, Sam, their baby here, is in hell, and because he was unbaptized, you know, well, I think there was like some. We will get to it, but I think there's some sort of Anabaptistry sort of happening there, maybe with Ralph Ineson's character, where he might have that sort of like baptized outside the church sort of beliefs of radical Protestants of the time. Speaking of witchcraft, a white claw mysteriously appeared. Some sort of fairy or goblin came by, and I apologize, by the way. In respect, I apologize for Sal, my dog, barking his head off. But
yeah, cheers! I'm actually drinking out of a. This is a reproduction of a 17th century cup from the Jamestown glassworks, which is great to be able to.
That's so cool.
Drink out of some period quality stuff. Of course, here you can see her shaking violently with this concoction wrapped all over her bodies. These concoctions actually often contained deliriants, what we would now call deliriants. And we have a lot of good evidence of women using these delirium-inducing ointments, both recreationally and ritually. Although they rarely appear in the trial transcripts. So there's a lot of debate actually in the scholarship about to what degree to what degree and how widely women were using these flying ointments at the time. So that's another big thing we can get into. I actually did a video recently about flying ointments.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just so you know, some people asking, does anybody have a movie timestamp? We are at 10 minutes, almost exactly. We're, yeah, we kind of spoke through, we sort of drank our way through one of the highlights of the movie there. But yeah, so that tidbit about the ointments are really interesting. What else can you speak kind of a bit more to that scene, Justin? Sort of is what sort of the baby smashing and all that, is that sort of in keeping with the occult beliefs of the time?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely in keeping with the beliefs that the witch hunters had. That is to say that unbaptized children would be murdered, their fat would be rendered, and the fat would be mixed with a variety of unguents. Although in almost all the trials, the various kinds of things that get mixed with them are psychedelically inert. It's in other texts, actually skeptical texts, people like Johann Weyer, that actually give us insights into the actual compounds, the actual herbs they used. And it's there that we learn, oh, these herbs actually are psychedelic in nature. So the trial transcripts don't often give us the actual compounds, which tells us they didn't know them because they were being tortured. They'd have told them gladly if they could have. They're typically things like bat's blood and soot and, stuff like that. But we do know that there were psychedelic ointments that were used for flight. And there's a common idea that they were smeared on brooms, then rubbed against the vagina or the anus, or actually inserted into the vagina, and that caused the rapid absorption of these things. That idea has basically been discredited now. It was introduced in 1973, and now it's mostly rejected. In fact, most accounts have them just slathering it all over their bodies, and most of the alkaloids in these psychedelic flying ointments were fat soluble, so that you could absorb them anywhere through your body. But interestingly enough, the most common thing that witches flew on back in the day, wasn't brooms. It was actually piles of feces. Curiously enough, mule and horse feces are the number one things that allegedly women flew on. But they could fly on chairs and fence posts and all manner of things. So the flight myth to the Sabbath is a big deal. We'll see it again, of course, at the end of the film.
Great. Wow, that's awesome. I had no idea about the poop.
Yeah, the poop thing is weird. That
is weird.
Yeah, it's weird. But yeah, bowls also. Women would also smear this stuff on them and sit in bowls and fly. So bowls were also not uncommon to fly.
Trogdor had a great comment here saying that does not sound aerodynamic.
No. But yeah, we have about a dozen accounts of these flying ointments being used, although again, never in the context of the trials. So it's always a bit of a documentary problem. But
yeah. So here we have in this scene we've got William, played by Ralph Ineson, and Caleb, who's, I don't know this actor's name, the kid, but he's awesome in this movie. I mean, he's one of the, he really steals the show. And at their kind of failing little farmstead that they've built here, and of course, the famously a lot of English colonists, especially in the early days, had a bit of a tough time growing things. So it's a nice little nod to kind of the early years of Plymouth Colony, I would assume, and I would hope. But what I think is really interesting about some of these father-son interactions that they have in this scene is you kind of, it does sometimes read a bit like a master's thesis about predestination, and some of the things that Caleb is going to say in this scene about how he is that the death of Sam, his baby brother, is sort of making him sort of question whether he is one of God's elect and whether he's going to heaven, and he has a little bit of a freak out about it, and especially kind of in the context of a little earlier we saw him looking down Thomason's shift, right, and he's kind of checking his own sister out, because of course they live in the middle of nowhere, right, and this guy is starting to have raging hormones and everything, and obviously that's a very, dirty, gross, incestual thing, but also from a Puritan perspective, especially, I mean, that's, compounded with the Puritan, not necessarily fear of sex, of course, but, the sort of godly application of sex, i.e., within the bounds of marriage. So,
And this is
And
also
this was
part of the witch narrative that's also terrifying, is the witch is sexually powerful, and that's
yeah,
horrifying.
yeah,
That she's
yeah,
naked, she's
exactly.
immediately naked, and so yeah, this is also what really strikes fear into the heart of both the Catholic and the Protestants, is
Yeah.
the sexual power of the witch.
Totally. And yeah, and there was and you know what Caleb has been talking about in this scene and his fears and his doubts is as kind of an adolescent specifically is something that that a lot of Puritans wrote about at that age.
Hmm.
Like John Winthrop, the when he lived in England and he was growing up, and the future first governor of Massachusetts Bay. You know, he wrote about his you know, about his doubts about predestination and about how much he hated himself. And, you know, his writings were full of a lot of self-loathing, and the kind that we kind of typically think of like, oh, those silly Puritans and how much they hated themselves. And, you know, we are all wretched sinners, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, you know, it's sort of, sure, there's a cultural context to it, but it's kind of also the same self-loathing that every adolescent boy goes through, and that every, you know, sort of sexually budding, you know, sort of person growing up goes through. And a lot of this fretting about predestination and being kind of unsure about your kind of place in the godly order of things, a lot of that these Puritans did, is very understandable when you kind of think about it from that kind of human dimension, right? As somebody who's sort of
Hmm.
struggling with hormones and struggling with puberty and everything like that. And that's some of, I think, some of the most wonderful sort of aspects of just history in general, is kind of like, you know, yeah, there is a cultural divide, of course, and sometimes it can be quite a large gulf. But if you can kind of dig down to the human element, then all of a sudden these people feel very real and very close. And yeah, I just love how how Caleb is just freaking out about this stuff, and I love William's reaction to it. You know, as again, it's kind of sort of adding that human element to a very you know, a time that is not very close to us, right? And that seems very alien to us. Is that, you know, we kind of think of the sort of hard ass, super religious dad to be just like, pull yourself together, you know, here, have a smack, kid. But instead, he kneels and he tells him, you know, I love you, kid. It's okay. It's going to be okay. You know, he's just adding that human dimension and the dimension of the sort of family unit, you know,
Right. Right.
is one of the brilliant things about this movie. Yeah.
Right. And in pulpit preaching, you know, it's easy to do, you know, sinners in the hands of an angry God from the pulpit. It's another thing to
Yeah.
deal with your kid.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's pulpit religion versus, you know, father, like you said, a father and son in the woods with their kid missing. So
Mhm.
you know, and again, I think I talk about this in an episode I made on my channel about the history of early American occultism, where, you know, Cotton Mather's and those guys talk a big game about superstition and about how all this stuff is forbidden and no one should do it. And
Mhm.
the truth of the matter is, we have overwhelming evidence of occult practices in Puritan New England. And
Yeah, I love that video of yours. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so it's clear that this was going on,
Mhm.
and yeah, and then and like you said, the puritanical angle when it comes to the predestination just adds another real real mess to it all,
Mm.
because, you know, it's at some level it's your fault that this is happening to you, which is
Yeah, yeah.
that's a it's a tough pill.
Yeah, it is. It for
Yeah,
sure is a tough pill. Yeah. Well, real quick, I wanted to mention the costumes.
yeah, yeah.
Like how beautiful are these
Mhm.
freaking costumes, and just like every stitch just screams authenticity, and the uh I guess the patterns for the clothing, as I understand them, were modeled on extant examples of 17th century clothing.
Right. I heard that this was
So
a big chunk of the budget.
yeah, I'm not
Was
surprised.
was
Yeah.
the costuming? Yeah.
I'm not surprised at all. And here we have one of our first creepy animal of the film, with many to
Yep.
come, with the rabbit.
Also, I can't imagine what that rifle would have actually done to that rabbit had it actually made contact.
Oh my god, yeah,
I don't.
yeah, yeah, just you
Yeah,
know, yeah.
it's a, you know, and here's a good Black Phillip.
Oh,
I
here we
mean,
go.
but you're
Here's
talking
our
about,
boy.
yeah, you're talking about, you know, whatever that was, 30 caliber rifle, something like that, smooth bore. That
Yes.
thing would, you would have had, you know, you would have had rabbit remains everywhere in that
Yeah,
forest.
yeah, yeah, precisely.
Yeah. So, um, and one of the interesting things also that Eggers does really well about this is that the elaborated theory of witchcraft wasn't completely unified all over Europe, and it had a particular form in England and New England, specifically around the idea that the devil or demons could inhabit animals or did inhabit animals
Mm,
that helped the witch. And these beings are called familiars.
Familiars. Yeah.
We have a couple of different names of them. My favorite is Vinegar Tom, which is we have a Vinegar Tom was the name of a pretty famous one. So Black Phillip being a good one as well. But the
Yeah, it
goat
definitely has.
being associated with the devil is a uniquely, mostly uniquely Anglo-Saxon, almost Scottish thing, which has gone on to great parlance later.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I was there's my next video is about some local Confederate monuments, and through a very roundabout sort of research hole that I was going through with one of the men who was commemorated by one of these monuments, I started looking into the history of 19th century Masonic conspiracy theories, and
there were a bunch of anti-Mason parties back then and stuff.
And there was and a lot about like Baphomet and sort of the origin of that sort of image of the Baphomet kind of image.
How a mistranslation of Muhammad's name becomes a demonic entity worshipped by worshipped by the Templars. That stuff is great.
Yeah, exactly. But it was
never doubt the power of a mistranslation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. For sure. But yeah, it was sort of interesting because I guess I hadn't realized that image of Baphomet was, as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, Justin, but is actually a pretty recent thing. That's like mostly a 19th century.
Yeah,
thing.
No, it's mostly from Eliphas Levi, from his 19th century work. It sort of actually it gets imported from England into France, and that image of Baphomet becomes really famous.
Yeah. So what were the Scottish origins of the goat as the devil?
It seems like it's probably just the fact that goats are the kind of animals that they had, and with the familiars that they had, the familiars they have, women are keeping cats basically for vermin control, and you keep a bunch of cats, and they help keep the rats away, and so a lot of these poor women couldn't afford professional catchers and stuff, and so a lot of these animals, cats became associated with as familiars, but also goats and other kinds of creatures, sometimes composite creatures too. There's a great woodcut, I think, that has Matthew Hopkins, the famous witch finder in England.
I know exactly which one you're talking about. Yeah,
and you can see the various animals in the foreground, and they have their names.
And Pyewacket and Peck in the Crown, and
Peck in the Crown, and I think Vinegar Tom's in there. He's another one of these familiars. Yeah. So the familiar is a particularly Anglo-Saxon New England thing. You wouldn't see that in Germany. You wouldn't see that in Spanish witchcraft.
Yeah, for sure.
So again, it's it's an important part of the witch narrative, the elaborate theory of witchcraft, as it's taken up into this region.
Totally. Timestamp, guys, is 22 minutes and 30 seconds.
I always I have a wood stove in my house, and I love movies that show guys cutting wood like this, because no person in their right mind who cuts wood ever cuts wood like this. You always bundle wood in the center and cut it. I cut mine in a tire. You spend so much energy cutting wood like that, but boy, do you look manly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it was funny. I was hiking on the Appalachian Trail this summer up in Maine, and there was one campsite we were at that had an axe that was just there, and a stump and wood that you could cut. And every man at that campsite was like, let me take a swing at that.
Take a whack at it. Yeah. I split a lot of wood for my wood stove. I get about 7 cords a year up here in Michigan, and I can tell you, anyone splitting wood like that, it'll cut you out of wood to split wood like that, but boy, you'll be tired.
Yeah.
Get a tire.
That's hilarious.
I love the stitching there. And, again, this is the kind of thing where I wish someone like Bernadette Banner could also let us know about all this totally. Some of the costume stuff. God, but it must have been terribly uncomfortable, all that wool. I mean, it must have been crazy.
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, speaking of, it was cold in New Orleans yesterday. It was in the 60s, but now it's edged back up to the 70s. So I might take off my wool doublet.
Schwitzing in the wool doublet, yeah.
No, I mean, for sure, it definitely, all that wool, and it just has, and even the linen, like even in that last scene when Ralph Ineson was taking his shirt off, and it just really had that kind of tactile sort of look to it,
Oh yeah.
The costumes in this movie just could not be
They're beautiful.
Better. Yeah.
And I'll tell folks, like I said, I'm drinking some homemade apple brandy. I won't say homemade by whom, but you can get this wonderful glassware made by the folks over at Jamestown, reproductions of actual found 17th century glassware. and it's just really lovely to have around. It's not exactly completely cheap, but really recommend if folks really want to drink the 17th century way.
Yeah, exactly. That's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, I would get one of my clay pipes, but I quit smoking last year.
Good for you.
Yeah, so this is sort of an interesting aspect of this movie as well, because we have like this little argument, which of course kind of becomes a really big deal later on when sort of accusations of witchcraft start flying around. But this argument between Thomason and Mercy, and Thomason basically and kind of doubles down, and to scare Mercy, who's being an annoying brat, she says, "I'm a witch and I'm going to eat you." And to hear Robert Eggers tell it, a lot of the sort of feminist themes of the movie were not intentional. Like, he just wanted to make a movie about witches and about witchcraft in a 17th century New English setting. But it for sure comes through in an interesting way, because how can it kind of not? It is such a huge part of the witch hunting craze and of our popular memory of this time period.
Right. And this is the most this is the most famous one of the most famous elements that actually begins a lot of witch trials is Malleus Maleficarum, the Bane witch hunting manual, says that one of the things the devil compels his followers to do is threaten people with witchcraft. And this is in almost all witch hunting trials. This is where it begins. It begins with often with a young woman threatening someone claiming to have supernatural or semi-supernatural powers or being a witch. And then that threat is taken deathly seriously and things go out of control from there. Yeah. Because once they start torturing you, then they can extract more names and it becomes a geometrically expanding effect. So,
so Tom, Tom Hart, thank you for the $10, dude. But Matthew asked, how do the accents hold up? And as you guys know, I have pretty specific ideas about 17th century English accents, and I'm a big fan of original pronunciation, and I use that for Witchfinder General, and I think it's probably the best sort of guess that we have for how people from Southern England would have sounded. Obviously, it's not completely accurate, but it is about as close as we can get based on our current knowledge. And also it also has great resources, because Shakespeare gets performed in original pronunciation. There's also great resources for actors. So sort of for that, both for a feature film set in this time period that I'm currently in pre-production for, which a lot of you guys know about, The Sudbury Devil, and also for my own stuff for Witchfinder General. There's just so many great resources about OP for actors specifically, that I find it to be the best sort of way to portray 17th century English. Now, the accents in The Witch are not in OP. As I understand it, there's a very good reason for this, and this is also like very nitpicky. And this is kind of, as you know, I'm not sort of really strict about historical accuracy in movies. I kind of feel like if it's a good movie, then kind of who cares. But sort of looking at it from a historical perspective, the way that these actors are speaking in The Witch is probably not what they would have sounded like. English was still a rhotic, or the sort of English accent was still rhotic during this period. So it was hard R's, like the Witchfinder General does, in that kind of almost Irish sort of piratey kind of way. So I believe that the reason that the actors speak the way they do, which is kind of this sort of very kind of old-timey kind of Midlands sort of bordering on Yorkshire working class English accent, is because of the child actors. So from what I understand, they cast these child actors who were like 4 or 5 years old and could not teach them a dialect. So they basically found these kids with these accents and modeled everybody's accents around them. I believe that's the reasoning behind it. Now, sometimes the kids' accents are like a little bit uneven. Like in the last scene, Mercy said something. He was like, she said, the yard. He said, I went to the yard, and which is, classic RP, right? It's the Queen's English. It's the yard, and that's not, people in the 17th century New England would have said yard. But one thing I think is really but that said, that is very nitpicky. And as if the Witchfinder General is any indication, if you make a movie about the 17th century English people and use OP, half of your audience are going to be scratching their heads and be like, why did they sound like Irish pirates? So in terms of clarity, sometimes it's better to be a little bit inaccurate just so you don't confuse your audience who maybe just doesn't know the inside baseball about a lot of this stuff. So I don't begrudge Robert Eggers for this choice at all. But I do think it is interesting to talk about. And one thing I do think is very commendable is how working class it sounds. This is before English, as far as we know, started to became the English accents became divided by class, right? Mm-hmm. So especially, in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, Queen Elizabeth would have sounded the same as the groundlings who are seeing Shakespeare plays, right? Like their accent would have had this, what we traditionally associate today as this very working class sort of cadence, and they would have said things like, like Thomas says in this movie, like, oh, you're letting me work, like you're sort of using me kind of like, I don't know, like Jamie Tart or, what I mean? Like some modern sort of working class English accents say. So I think overall, I think kind of given the circumstances and kind of given the fact that this is a movie with a lot of child actors and everything, I think they did a really great job with the accent, and what inaccuracies are there, I don't begrudge them for at all.
I think another interesting theological point about this that might be worth mentioning is Thomasine. That Thomasine's saying that she's a witch and, saying that she's really done all this stuff. From a Puritan point of view, from the predestination point of view, that is basically foreshadowing that it could be the case from a theological point of view that Thomasine's been damned the entire time, that she's predestined to her destiny, and that this is all part of God's plan. And that was a common idea in people have to understand that the witch heresy that the demonologists had in mind wasn't just sort of a weird women doing things in the forest thing. It was the devil's last-ditch effort to destroy humanity and afflict God before the devil was destroyed. Yeah. The witch trials in the minds of the demonologists were the very end of time. They really thought this was the end, the complete end. Yeah. And that when that intersects again with the sort of Puritan predestinationism, it could just have been that from an outside perspective, someone could have easily looked at this situation and said to themselves, yeah, like the fact that this family is destroyed by their daughter who was predestined to be a witch, it's actually proof of God's greatness. Yeah. Which just shows you the theological loops that you can end up jumping through to make all this, to make sense of the world that you live in.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, exactly. And that's a key part of the witch hunter point of view, right? Is that this is all part of God's plan. Like God is allowing the devil to do these things. Right. And yeah, which is sort of one of the most fascinating things about it. And yeah, the apocalyptic aspect of it as well. I mean, is such a huge, and even sort of New Englanders at the time, believed that because they were in the devil's country, because they had sort of chased the devil to his Bowser's castle across the ocean, to the end of the world. And now they were sort of setting the stage for this final confrontation as told in Revelation. So,
I mean, Bradford really thought he was building the New Jerusalem. I mean, this was meant to be the end. Exactly. And people really should never, when Bradford talks about this being the New Jerusalem, he's not using flowery language. He really thinks Plymouth Plantation is the beginning of the end.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think that apocalyptic element of all this, that's a super important theological aspect of what's going on in this witch stuff.
Totally. So I love the parents' little sort of like curtained off bed, which this is my area of expertise at all, but I do I as I understand, that was kind of a bit of a fancy thing. So probably for kind of homesteaders at the edge of the wilderness in early days of Massachusetts Bay Colony, probably they would not have had anything quite so luxurious, but yeah, sort of to have even a little bit of privacy, as a parent to have sex with your wife or have sex with your husband or whatever was a luxury. So and it definitely kind of makes sense in the context of the movie, but I'm not sure that just like a deeply rough and tumble kind of frontier homesteaders would have had kind of the means to bring up
No, this would have
to
been
bring
this
something like
bark
that in.
roof. I mean, and also you can tell it's not cold yet because there are no animals in the house.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think the Townsend's channel, which I love, they built a pretty
Yeah,
rustic
they're great.
homestead, and yeah, you know, a bark roof is what you're going to get, and even making a bark roof at this time, this is being built. It seems like pretty late in the season. You're not getting even a bark roof on there.
Yeah,
You're going to be cold and wet.
yeah, yeah,
Man.
exactly.
Um,
So here's an interesting question. Are there any symbols in the movie that are distinctly American Puritan as opposed to English Puritan? I mean, yeah, I mean, nothing really springs to mind. Yeah, I'm not sure. That is a great question. But yeah, I don't really think so. I mean, I think a lot of it is, I mean, there's certainly references to American, uh, to sort of New England sort of events like, as we talked about in the beginning, the trial of Anne Hutchinson, which is pretty much quoted word for word in the opening scene in the meeting house. But yeah, no, it's there. A lot of the and also, as we'll see, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at length during the possession scene that comes a little bit later. There's a lot of Salem in that,
which is interesting because I think this is taking place in the 1630s,
yes,
which
yeah,
is
exactly, much earlier.
which is it's much earlier. It's 18 years before the Connecticut trials, and of course the Connecticut trials, which began in 47, 48, are the first trials with Alice. I can't remember her last name. Being the first killed in those trials. So in an interesting way, this film takes place 18 years before the earliest witch trials in this part of the world.
Yeah.
And of course, we have the big three trials. We have the Connecticut trials, which lasted the longest. We have the Salem trials, which are the most intense. And then we have the Bermuda trials, which no one talks about. But because we always imagine Puritans and the English living in these kinds of forests. But can you imagine a witch trial on a beach?
Yeah.
In Bermuda. So the Bermuda trial was also a big deal. So those are the three big trials, and this takes place about 18 years before even the Connecticut trials.
Yeah, and also there's those were there weren't any witch trials there, but one of my little kind of pet interests of this period is Barbados, and the sort of English sugar plantations, and yeah, sort of a lot of us, we envision Puritans and in the colonies, and we sort of think New England, but in fact, there were also very hardcore Puritans kind of living that antebellum sort of Southern plantation type of life in Barbados, and making obscene amounts of money with the sugar industry, and also some interesting stories about they weren't yet abolitionist, but they were sort of anti-slavery or what you could call sort of welfarist Quakers in Barbados in the midst of sort of as the sort of first huge sort of slave driven sort of sugar industrial sort of operation was then getting going in Barbados. There was sort of the first inklings of sort of that abolitionist sentiment among Quakers. So that was kind of interesting. Caleb, you're so screwed, baby.
Yeah, and you also get a sense of the size of that weapon. Look at that firearm; it's as big as he is.
Yeah.
I think if he wants to fire that thing, he better set himself against that tree.
yeah, exactly. This is one of the spookiest scenes in the movie, I think.
And again, the sound design here, and again, I think that we pointed out earlier, but just to reiterate it, just how terrifying this would have been to have been. In the forest at night alone, even with that firearm, which is, again, I think he'd be better off using it as a club.
Yeah, exactly. Poor Fowler. Ugh. Yeah, I don't like that. Yeah, if you said, Justin, earlier that seeing kind of bad things happen to little kids as a father is kind of where that sort of really creeps you out in movies and stuff. For me, it's the animals. I'm a huge sissy about that kind of stuff. I just cannot.
Yeah,
you can mow down huge armies of people, and I shrug, but hurt a pig or a dog or a cow, and I go ballistic.
No, that's right. I think that's the most disturbing scene in the original Halloween, is that scene where they go into the dog. He got hungry.
Yeah.
That's to me the most horrifying scene of the entire film. It just shows you how horrifyingly monstrous Michael Myers is. He just killed and ate a dog.
Yeah, exactly.
How inhuman he is. Yeah, but so yeah, I think that. But again, the animals here are functioning very much like familiars. Like, the entire natural world's against them. I think that's part of what's going on, is that the forest is against them. It's kind of Evil Dead vibes a little bit, but even the animals are slowly being taken over by this malevolent force of witchcraft, or that even the animals are serving the power of the devil.
Well, and Evil Dead. Interesting that you mentioned that, as we're watching Caleb struggle through the
thicket.
The thicket and the branches that are almost kind of ensnaring him and stuff. And again, that's sort of like, but again, that kind of goes back to, the Puritan imagination and their conception of the wilderness, which was a hostile, satanic place. And that sort of, when you were beyond the bounds of the plantation, that was the devil's country. And also, I think being a New Englander by birth and Southern by the grace of God myself, it certainly kind of takes me back to like childhood, and exploring the woods behind my house, and being in these places in sort of New England, small town New England, that are sort of, I go back and to those woods today, and there's 6 acres and you can walk across them in 10 minutes. But, to a 10-year-old me, it was this whole,
huge,
realm, that sort of, and there's a primal kind of terror in that.
So this is the great Hansel and Gretel scene.
Exactly. Well, I was going to say, like, a lot of the stuff, the imagery associated with the witch in this movie, I feel like is a little bit more sort of European, a little bit more continental, that like it sort of is more Grimm's fairy tales than it is anything the Puritans have.
I agree. And typically, the image of the young Lavicinius witch, and this is one of the few images of color we get in this film. The red cloak. I think this is much more folk tale-y, coming out of the German world, as opposed to the sort of classic hag witch that you would have had depicted in England and Scotland primarily. Typically the women that were accused of witchcraft were often women at the edges of society, often widows and other kinds of women. But the sound design here also is just,
oh man, so spooky.
It's terrifying, and we'll get it at the end as well. But I like the image of him advancing despite the fact that he's crying. That he's not doing it; he's being compelled at some level. And again, she's preying on his sexual desires.
Exactly.
So
actually,
classic.
I don't know if you can see, I've got goosebumps.
The sound design is just,
oh man, it's outstanding. Exactly. Well, that the Germanic thing, exactly. That's the red riding cloak, of course, the like little sort of hut in the woods where the kids get gobbled up. I mean, there is a lot of that. And
what you actually don't find in Puritan, in the witch trials, you never see that stuff. This is, I think, really Eggers going out a bit on a limb in a way that's not completely real. It's not realistic to the kinds of things that would have worried the Puritans.
Because exactly. Well, and also I think it's a good choice on his part, because honestly, a lot of the, even though the Puritan worldview, I feel like, is very fascinating, and I really love kind of immersing myself in that world and their conception of the supernatural, their sort of ideas about what witches were up to, certainly compared to what the Catholics were thinking at that time and what was going on sort of in the witch hunters what the witch hunters in continental Europe were thinking. Like, the Puritans' ideas of witchcraft were actually like pretty boring by comparison, honestly, it was, sometimes, I mean, they imagined these great witches' Sabbaths, and of course you know much more about this than I do. So, but that were, these huge congregations of witches who were sort of plotting and planning to, it's a great phrase that Cotton Mather uses, to the extirpation of the vine which God hath here planted, which the Witchfinder General said once or twice, which is to sort of uproot the flower of Christianity in the New World, right? So, but they certainly weren't, they didn't. It was almost kind of like a satanical meeting, a town meeting. It was kind of a dark reflection of their own political and cultural reality that they were imagining. It wasn't like orgies and sacrifices and it wasn't horror movie shit. It was very it was almost kind of very mundane, and it was almost kind of the upside down, the sort of dark reflection of sort of Puritan society.
And typically the English.
I'm going to go grab a drink. I will be 5 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, and typically the English and the Scottish don't typically focus that much on flight. And what's interesting is that it's mostly them importing ideas from continental Europe, where you get a lot of these images of flight, witches taking flight and meeting at these big sabbats. And of course, the most famous example of that is an early 18th century book called The History of Witches and Warlocks, where you get the famous women flying with the brooms and the witches' hats. So, if folks are interested who are watching, take a look at my channel. I've done a lot of episodes on the history and development of witches and witchcraft and how these ideas developed. And part of what's really fascinating to me about them is that they don't come out of whole cloth. They develop very slowly, beginning primarily in the 13th century, and it's only after several hundred years that we get the elaborated theory of witchcraft, and it sticks by the mid 17th century, and we're still living. If you want to buy a witch's costume, you're at some level, you're some level echoing some of these ideas that come out of the elaborated theory, and mostly by the mid 17th century.
Thanks for the donation, Malpertuis. Really appreciate it.
And you also, can you imagine being out in the rain with all that wool? Can you imagine? What a great workout program.
I don't have to.
I bet you've experienced it. I can only imagine just lugging around 100 pounds of water.
Oh, and it just smells terrible.
I can only imagine. I mean, I guess they had oilcloth. I mean, they would have oilcloth covers and stuff at this point, but so I guess
and actually, he's Ralph Ineson. His character has a sort of a bit of a raincoat. It's like I guess maybe it is oilcloth, but it's
probably it has to be. It has to be oilcloth.
So here's an interesting question. So around 1630, how much wilderness or untouched woods would have Puritans have encountered in the UK rather than America? Certainly, and I touched upon this in defense of Puritanism in my my sort of big last video, but certainly in East Anglia, this was before a lot of where a lot of Puritans were from. Boston is a town in East Anglia. Sudbury, where I'm from, well, technically I'm from Wayland, Massachusetts, the original settlement of Sudbury Plantation. Sudbury is a town in East Anglia. So this was before a lot of the fens and marshes in East Anglia were drained, and a lot of the folklore of that region, sort of going back to Anglo-Saxon days, as far as we know, sort of is kind of based around that sort of environment, just wet, marshy, misty kind of environment. I often kind of I think this is I don't know, maybe a weird comparison to make, but I often sort of think about it in terms of Velen from The Witcher 3. If any of you guys played that game, where it is a marshy, muddy, sort of very wet, swampy area with a lot of sort of monsters associated with that, like monsters that kind of come out of the water and spirits that come out of the water and that are associated with sort of the miasma of the swamp and with decay and with sort of this sort of soggy kind of sort of, I guess, element to them, right? They sort of they're always kind of associated with that sort of feeling. Okay, so we've just rescued Caleb from out in the woods, right. And shit's about to get real.
Yeah, out of the pan and in the fire though, because they're going to give him some 18th century, some 17th century medicine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, bleeding to reduce his fever. I have an 18th century bloodletting tool in my collection. It's spring loaded, and so it's really when you see a spring loaded bloodletting tool, you're just like, I often marvel at just how terrifying it is.
Oh God, yeah.
I think that's how they killed George Washington.
Yeah. And here we have a great. I feel like this always reminds me of The Shining. This scene where William is just chopping it. Oh, and there's Black Phillip. He's so cute. But yeah, there's definitely it is interesting. They kind of set it up, don't they? Sort of the Shining ending where you kind of expect Ralph Ineson to just go absolutely postal and murder the family with an axe. But certainly glad they don't do. We'll get to it. One of my very few artistic sort of and filmmaking kind of qualms with this movie is come sort of in the third act. But yeah, I also am very glad that they did not do that, because that would have just been the most obvious thing to do. Yeah. Stefan, how's it going, man? I see you. No, you can't trust the people that live in the fens.
I wonder, this image of the blood and the milk. This is also a pretty classic trope in the elaborated theory of witchcraft, is that the animals also become infected and don't produce the natural things they're supposed to produce. That they'll give blood other than milk, and they'll I mean they're yeah, all kinds of bizarre chemicals come out of them that are unnatural, that shows that the devil has corrupted it. But had by the 1630s, had enclosure been finished in England? Had that process come to had it come to completion?
No. It had not come. It hadn't come to completion. But it was certainly like it was in the process of happening,
Right.
for sure. Yeah. I love this scene with Kate Dickie, who of course is like probably best known for also playing a creepy mom in in Game of Thrones. But I just really love this this whole monologue, and where she's talking in and again in kind of a sexual way, sort of coming back to kind of that theme of female sexuality, talking about how she had a dream when she was Thomason's age about how Christ ravished her with his love, and how she had never felt that measure of love again. And yeah, also just a very, it's sort of beyond Puritanism. It is a very kind of Christian thing. I mean, it explicitly says in, I forget which of the four Gospels, but very explicitly says, you need to love God more than your family. And that is certainly sort of in terms of family dynamics. As I'm sure probably people in this chat can attest to, coming from like a very Christian background, where that's sort of like, it is kind of almost like God is sort of a member of the family whose sort of feelings need to be considered, and everything. And it's just sort of very true to this perspective, and in this time, and in that sort of specifically, that just thought this sort of very hardline Calvinist Protestant sort of point of view, right? And I think that's just a wonderful detail. And also just one of the great things about this monologue is, and she's saying here, like, I want to go home to England. It really kind of humanizes this character who is almost kind of the villain of the movie up until this point, because she is, really cruel to Thomason, and, and she is the hard ass, she's the one who's making the rules, and William, the dad, is, is a lot more forgiving and a lot more chill. And, and again, it's just like, one of the many brilliant things about this movie are the family dynamics, and kind of the don't look now sort of aspect to it, where it's like, it is really the heart of the movie, how real this family feels. And I mean, just in terms of an achievement in screenwriting, to make a 17th century family seem so relatable and so realistic, it's but also so authentic to the time, and to feel truly authentic to the time. I mean, it is an immense achievement. I will cease blowing Robert Eggers now, but that's one of the many things I love about this movie.
Yeah. I will say that this is one of the places where Puritan theology really doesn't have a great handle on things, where I think Catholic theology really does have an outlet for this kind of thing. Is there's an entirely huge literature on female mystics who have these sort of erotic encounters with Christ, and leave behind some of the most amazing poetry ever written. I mean, people like Heidelberg Brabant has these incredibly shocking poems about erotic love for Christ, and feeling Christ in her bed with her and stuff. That there's an outlet, at least in some forms of Catholicism, whereas the Puritans, they sometimes can paint themselves into a corner with their theology. But theology always paints you into a corner. It's always which corner do you want to get painted into?
Yeah, exactly.
Pick your corner, any corner.
Well, and there's also those great sculptures, those great Italian sculptures, right?
The ecstasy of the ecstasy sculptures. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, the ecstasy sculptures, which are, I mean, truly, I mean, just artistically, just like absolutely beautiful.
Agony of Teresa. Oh yeah.
Yeah, but also really kind of speak to that, and certainly, I mean, I can, I mean, in a lot of these, the sort of Catholic Protestant dynamic, certainly in the States, I feel like very much with us today. I mean, I feel like I can attest to it personally as somebody who grew up in Massachusetts and then moved to Louisiana, and just kind of coming from, a place that, if you kind of know what that early colonial history is, you see evidence of it everywhere, culturally and geographically, in terms of place names, in terms of how towns are structured, and you know, a lot of the old meeting houses are still standing. They're still at the center of town, you know, and then kind of going to a place that was so inspired by that sort of was in the Latin American Caribbean orbit and was so shaped by Catholicism, and you know, and you go to the French Quarter, which if any of y'all are in town, I'm probably gonna go out after this live stream and get drunk there. So, you know, come say hi. But yeah, so it's, you know, the St. Louis Cathedral, like right at the center, right near the Place d'Armes, you know, Jackson Square, as it's now known. And you know, that, and certainly culturally, it's very evident as well. But anyway, this is,
this image also is really,
yeah.
This image is also really classic of the witchcraft ideas is the ravaging of people by witches, spectral ravaging, where male and female witches will sexually assault people, and so you have something like this happening here to him. And of course, he is in fact, of course, you know, in this movie, actually bewitched, and the witch is spectrally attacking him, and of course, during the Salem trials, spectral evidence of various kinds, including seeing people being assaulted by this would be considered evidence.
Yeah,
it's funny also, just you know, being on the not Protestant, not Catholic, not Christian, being on the Jewish side of this. It's sort of funny not having a dog in the fight.
Well, you know, I was baptized Serbian Orthodox, so but I do kind of you know, culturally, I feel like I'm much more shaped by Protestantism and by kind of Puritanism. So I'm in a sort of an interesting middle ground too, I guess. But
but also being Southern, it's funny, you know,
sure,
on, I think I spent more time learning about the Civil War. You know, everything built up the Civil War, and everything is a commentary upon that, and at least in the way I was taught history.
For sure. Well, I don't know much about that.
No, nothing.
But so obviously this scene is like, this is kind of the closest that the witch gets to kind of the crucible, right? It's sort of the sort of witch trial panic type of sort of aspect of this whole mythology. So and you know, the performances in this scene are just second to none and amazing. But you know, obviously a lot of what Jonas and Mercy, the two little kids, are saying here, you know, straight out of court records from Salem in 1692, you know, and even just the fact that it starts with two creepy little kids, exactly the same as
but they can't pray that the devil.
I cannot finish my prayer. Exactly.
And this was a common motif, not just in the idea that the devil could actually prevent you from remembering prayers, but also that one of the reasons why torture was insisted on in many of the trials was because the devil could actually force the witch to be silent through torture. And so a lot of the demonological manuals actually say that you can turn the torture up more than normal. Because the devil has the ability to make these people quiet.
Sure shot. Thanks for the $20. That's a very interesting comment. Anyway,
also the great black dog, very probably the most the images of the dog as the devil is probably the most common in this region at the time. Most typically associated with the black dog.
Oh my God. Like, where do you find this kid, you know, just with this performance? Good. Oh my God. And so, what I love about this is when when they gather around and they're chanting the 23rd Psalm, and you know, and the cure to witchcraft, you know, Puritans agreed, was earnest prayer. Like that was the antidote, was you got to pray. And the fact that it does kind of have power in this scene, and it's interesting. It's subtle, right? It isn't like this scene is not super over the top. You could, you know, watch this scene and you know, make the argument that this isn't really supernatural, you know. And it's sort of classy in that way, right? If it was I feel like maybe a different director would have had, you know, holy blue lights coming, you know, or some sort of supernatural kind of done some exorcist stuff, you know, with mist and mood lighting and stuff. But just the fact that it's all very natural lighting and that the performances are driving everything, and there is this sort of It is supernatural, and we kind of know that because we've seen The Witch and we've seen creepy supernatural stuff happen. But it isn't in a way, because obviously Puritans believed that witchcraft was 100% real and that this sort of
Sure.
stuff had supernatural causes, but they wouldn't have, but they didn't see, holy blue light, emerging out of a holy sword. You know what I mean? There wasn't sort of it was too modernized, pretty mundane. It was still, the real world, and the real world and the supernatural real world were, of course, inseparable for most Puritans. So,
Right. And Puritans in general were much more, I would say, rationalistic.
oh,
All things
absolutely.
told. That,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Well,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, yeah, and I touched upon that in yeah, a big part of my In Defense of Puritanism video was like, listen, there was sort of echoes of the Enlightenment in a lot of this.
oh, yeah.
It was,
Oh,
yeah,
it
yeah,
was a heavily, I mean, it was a literate society. It was a society based on argumentation. It was a society in which you had to publish and write and argue
yeah,
your positions. It wasn't a,
yeah,
so yeah, I think that, um, they can be painted, I think, in a very stereotypically silly way, but,
yeah.
but, um,
Yeah, this is just a heartbreaking,
no,
heartbreaking
it's
freaking
terrible.
scene. Yeah,
But this is sort of like you said earlier, this is all taken at some level from the Salem,
yeah,
the Salem business,
totally.
and of course they're going to turn their turn, as often happens in family dynamics.
Mhm.
You turn your rage on the ones who aren't afflicted, which is a dreadful
Yeah,
psychological fact about how we operate.
yeah,
Um, um, Which also, again, this could also just be, if you want to take it from a Puritan, really hardcore Calvinist perspective, this is just Thomasine, God directing Thomasine to her ultimate destiny, which
yeah,
unfortunately is her damnation.
yeah, yeah.
And again,
Exactly,
so again,
exactly.
it's when you want to take a really really high resolution theological picture of this from the eyes of a Puritan, they would say
Mhm.
this is all proof
Yeah,
of God, and unfortunately,
yeah,
Thomasine just, in
yeah,
God's infinite wisdom, this is the decision God made,
yeah, yeah. Exactly,
which
exactly.
is a bit of a nightmare, I think, for most of us modern people. But again, I
Mhm.
think you have to I think what folks have to understand is that determinism as a theology, while we don't like it in many ways, is a great antidote for a world suffering from the Hundred Years' War and living
Yes.
in this area. It's a world in which everything makes sense.
Yeah. Totally.
So
Totally.
it's
Well, and that's
it's a rational world. It's a world in which God has planned everything out, even the
yeah.
suffering.
Yeah.
So
Well, and this is something we were kind of talking about before we started about how about some of the sort of making comparisons between the witchcraft craze and the elaborated theory of witchcraft and kind of conspiracy theories and sort of how
mhm.
that intersects.
No,
And
absolutely.
and yeah, that is like, I think that's I mean it's sort of a bit of a cliche and it's said a lot, but I think for good reason it's true, is that like the great appeal of conspiracy theories is that it is it the world in which conspiracy theories exist is an ordered world. It is a world
Right.
that makes sense. It is a world that where there is the clear bad guy, which is the Democrats drinking adrenochrome.
Yeah,
Like, and
adrenochrome, yeah.
as long as
Which
we can kill, as long as we can arrest them and put them in prison,
everything will be
then
fine.
everything will be fine.
Right,
Yeah, exactly.
and it's amazing how much of the modern QAnon conspiracy theory leans on the elaborated theory of witchcraft and
Yeah.
anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of things like the
Oh,
blood
sure.
libel. That
Yeah.
it is positively shocking to see some of the stuff that I see online, and I'm like, this is just kind of warmed up, microwaved witchcraft.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and there's
And the blood
also and
libel.
yeah, the blood libel, exactly. Because I mean, there's I mean, again, it's sort of just because it's on my mind because it's the video that I'm making now, which I'm trying not to spoil it too much for the viewers here, but kind of diving into 19th century conspiracy theories, specifically sort of Catholic conspiracy theories about Masons, and generally, when they said Masons, who was kind of pulling the strings on that, right? It was sort of the
Mhm.
Jews, and it was and a lot of it was about sort of and it kind of, there's obviously a 20th and 21st century kind of version of this too, in America specifically, about sort of international bankers and that kind of stuff, where it is sort of if not explicit, it's very thinly veiled anti-Semitism, and yeah, that is sort of ultimately sort of what a lot of it comes down to is, you know, they're poisoning the wells, and they're drinking baby blood, and
Right.
it's just kind of, it kind of goes back to the Black Death in a lot of ways. It's just sort of the same sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, just kind of regurgitated for different times.
Right.
And actually, somebody in the chat said, sort of what was kind of the intersection, you know, what sort of we're bringing up like anti-Semitism and sort of witchcraft, and sort of how did that like interact?
Yeah, so the Venn diagram in many ways is to what produced the elaborated theory of witchcraft was a Venn diagram of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that mostly emerged and during the Black Death, starting in 1348, and also long-standing ideas that developed in sort of the anti-Waldensian, anti-Cathar campaigns. And between the anti-Cathar and anti-Waldensian campaigns and anti-Semitism, you begin to get the structure, the basic structure of the elaborated theory of witchcraft. And of course, most of the image of the classic witch with the green hair and the black hair that's all over the place, and the green skin and the nose. So much of that is based on medieval imagery of Jewish women. So, so there's not that people shouldn't dress as witches, but just, you know, be thoughtful about how this kind of plays into sort of crappy stereotypes of you know, this sort of hysterical inability to wake up or go into fits. These are well tested and also in Salem.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are famous stories where they tested these women by applying fire to their feet and pins to their bodies to attempt to arouse them and wake them up, and they did resist it. And so there's anthropologists have a concept of this called a cultural specific syndrome, that is a kind of mental illness localized within a very specific cultural context. And this is a case where you really get a feedback loop between this stuff.
I mean, and this, and just I feel like this is kind of the sequence where the movie just kind of ratchets it up to 11 and just kind of doesn't stop until the last frame, you know, just the we're truly kind of in the depths of the belly of the beast now. And just the
right. And you can see the logical traps that emerge, right? That the inability to pray is proof that you're bewitched, but the ability to pray could also be generated by the devil too.
Well, it's the Matthew Hopkins stuff, right? It's like if you sink, you know, then
if you don't confess, then you're lying, you know. And if you say you're not really one, then the devil is the father of lies. So it's an absolute, it's a black trap. And of course,
totally.
What's also interesting in this situation, and this is not a juridical situation, but technically in the Scottish and the British situation, Anglo-Saxon situation, generally speaking, torture was actually illegal. You could not torture witches, and you couldn't swim them. In fact, you couldn't swim witches since the 13th century. The church, the Lateran Council, forbid this. Ordeals to prove witchcraft, or just ordeals in general, are forbidden, including swimming witches. But this was a situation in Scotland, especially, where torture was being used by local magistrates because they were being basically forced to do this by mobs. And so what's, again, interesting about the situation here in colonial New England is that torture technically wasn't allowed, but whipping people was allowed. And you could whip people for crimes, and if in the process of whipping them they confess to other things, well, you have grounds to begin official prosecution for witchcraft. And that's how the Connecticut trial began. Was basically a punishment through whipping that ultimately led to a so-called confession of witchcraft.
For sure. Well, just for those who don't know, what's the kind of Cliff Notes version of the Connecticut trials? You know, because it is sort of the lesser known sort of New England. I mean, there's a couple of them. You know, I mean, in Massachusetts too, there were a couple minor sort of witchcraft incidents.
Couple minor. So the major thing is, it seems like they mostly were located around Hartford, and it's just this situation where what you get is a question of bewitchment, and then an accusation of bewitchment that's derived at basically through torture, whipping. And once you kind of turn it on, it's hard to turn it off. And you would get confessions, and you would get names, and you would get confessions, and you get names. And this went on from 1647, 1648, all the way until I think the end of the century. I think it went on for all. And really, the thing that put the brakes on it was the governor of Connecticut at the time, which was Winthrop Jr. Winthrop Jr. was the governor. He was trained as an alchemist, actually, and a natural magician. And so he had seen some of the excesses of the trials and on the continent, and came back, and in many ways really pushed the brakes, and in some ways helped to stop the Connecticut trial from getting worse than what it was, which is a similar thing which happens in Salem. Once it gets to the governor's office, the governor's like, hold on, my daughter's not a witch. Which is basically what put a stop to the Salem trials at some level.
Well, exactly. And with Phipps and everything. Well, it was and Winthrop Jr., I mean, having like I mean, he's a really interesting guy, and having you've been in the English Civil War, and having sort of spent so much of his life back in the old country, sort of kind of furthering the Protestant agenda, or the Puritan agenda, right? And sort of and he was somebody who was like, in a way that I think is kind of hard to understand in the modern sense. And I don't want to make the mistake of necessarily kind of glorifying sort of the past, or sort of thinking like, oh, the old days, but somebody whose sense of duty was so profound. And it's a way that's kind of hard to think about today with sort of just with our modern life. Is just his sense of duty was so profound that he was like, I'm going to leave my family. I'm probably never going to see them again. And I'm going to go back to England to fight the English Civil War. And then political duties are going to take me into Parliament and working with Cromwell to set up the Commonwealth and everything, and I think I'm probably misquoting this here, so I apologize, guys. But I think he wrote to his brother or something where he basically said, I'm probably never going to see you ever again. But that's okay, because this is God's will and this is what he wants me to do. And, and it's just like, I mean, again, from a modern perspective, and certainly as somebody myself who kind of, prioritizes kind of family and friends and relationships over pretty much everything, it's kind of hard to imagine that sort of a mindset.
No, Winthrop Jr., like you said, he's a fascinating guy. And also just because he's so worldly compared to so much of the so much of the parochialism that was, the colonies were weird because they were highly literate in many ways. They were probably some of the most literate area of the world at the time, but very, very, very parochial in many ways too. And Winthrop is really a strange moderating influence, but still never, one can be moderating and never abandon one's values, which I think is something that is hard for us to imagine of the Puritans.
Yeah, for sure.
That you can be both and.
Just real quick, the silver cup in the background of this shot.
It's back.
Yeah, it's back. It's back. Thy father's silver cup. And so this is another kind of thing we have here with Kate, Kate Dickey's character, sort of, her children delivered back to her, and this sort of idea of obviously sort of the idea of Christian temptation goes back to the Gospels, and goes back to, the devil tempting Christ in the wilderness and all that sort of stuff. But like, but it is interesting how, and obviously this movie kind of plays on that by, as you said, Justin, Caleb, is sort of receives sort of sexual advances, which is the kind of thing that he's kind of going through with, and the thing that he wants the most, as he's going through the throes of puberty. And Kate here receives her children, which is the thing that she wants the most. I feel like this is obviously it's fitting with Christian theology, but it's also, I feel like it's also a bit of a horror movie trope. You know what I mean? It's sort of, it's certainly, would this have been, Justin, this would have been something that like people back then would have conceptualized, where it was like, it's like my secret desires are being met by the devil, or no?
Yeah. Typically you would, the way the devil gets to you is the devil makes you promises, and that part of what you do is, and the promises are always very boring. I mean, it's sort of what you can imagine what are in the minds of witch hunters, which is basically sex and money. And so, they're not exactly the most liberated dudes. So much of it is just the idea that women are these hardcore sexual beings who just want to have sex all the time. And so the devil can copulate with them. And they're often poor, so they can eat whatever they want, but the food is always tasteless, and the devil's penis is always cold, weirdly enough. Or not weirdly enough, I don't know. But the sex is always they get what they bargain for, but it's always some pale version of what it is. And so we get the same thing with the nursing in just a minute. Probably one of the, I think, the most terrifying scenes in the film. with
Yeah.
the raven.
Yeah,
Um,
and here we have the big close up of the
yep.
witch
Yeah.
in sort of her old crone form, and there's the raven. Yeah,
Yeah, this
yeah,
and her just slapping his
supremely
character.
creepy scene.
Yeah, it has to
Supremely
be
creepy.
yeah, I think that's to me the most one of the,
Woo,
one of the frightening
woo.
scenes in the film.
Yeah,
So the, again, the devil's the father of lies, and the devil will
yeah,
give you what you ask for, but
yeah,
never in the
exactly.
one. But again, it's never, you never, in these confessions, you never get some really elaborate, I want to get 5 million subscribers on YouTube desires. It's always like, the devil, I want to have a lot of sex with a bunch of people at a thing, and have
Yeah,
a bunch of money. So it's
yeah.
it's pretty boilerplate desires.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, when I made my deal with the devil for my YouTube subscribers, he, he stiffed me. He only gave me 230,000. I was like, all right,
Hey,
what is this, Luke? What are you doing to me?
yeah, your
Um,
devil deal's doing better than mine. I'm only knocking the door of 100,000, but
we'll get you
the
there. We'll get you there,
yeah,
Justin.
it's just sign the book with the man. I do wonder if these roofs, to me, I wonder, this would be a kind of thing I wonder, if or Townsend's folks know, these sort of thatch roofs.
Mm.
I mean, those are a pain. I've seen traditional folks make those things, and I wonder if that would have been the kind of thing he could have thrown up by himself.
Yeah, see, that is a bit of a problem that I have with this movie. Like, again, very nitpicky, and I love
yeah,
this movie,
I'm
and
being
I think that
ridiculous.
everybody involved, yeah, did a great job. But I do think that it does strain my suspension of disbelief a little bit that like this one family with only one able-bodied, man was able to put all this stuff
Build
up
all this,
in.
yeah, it seems
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
unlikely.
Yeah,
Um,
but that's it's whatever. It's
yeah,
something
yeah.
that you can wave away with a hand. I mean, there's so much that this movie does right. And Black Phillip
Backfield
is back.
strikes.
Is back for the money shot. Oh, he's so cute.
Yeah,
I
apparently
understand
he's been in
that.
several movies.
Yeah, yeah. I guess his name is Charlie, as I understand.
Yeah.
And he is a goat actor, and yeah, I guess he was a nightmare to work with, as I
Yeah,
understand.
the goat actor
That's what the
union.
actors were saying.
He
Yeah,
does.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, maybe they should strike too.
yeah, all power. Well, they have nothing to lose but their chains.
Their chains. Exactly. Okay, so we have William's death scene here, and we kind of talked through his kind of defining scene in the movie, which was, and sort of the irony of him being buried by his own,
Literally buried in all
hoist
the
on
wood
his
he's
own
been.
petard. Yeah,
Yep.
he's been chopping. But we kind of talked through his sort of big scene, which was him basically praying and admitting to God that it's all his fault. Where they're in America and they're banished from the plantation because of his pride. And I think that's just such a wonderful kind of similarly to the monologue that Kate Dickey has, where we really get to know her just as a person. I think that's just such a wonderful. Obviously it's incredibly moving to just like see a father, just begging to God, please spare my children. But also, I think it's like very, very telling for that character, and also just a really great like.
That's the Puritan go-to. Blame yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, blame yourself.
When in doubt, blame yourself. But yeah,
thou art a wretched sinner. Yeah. But yeah, just a wonderful scene, wonderful performance. Okay, so I said that I had issues with this movie's third act, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. I kind of at a certain point, it's sort of like it's nice and creepy what happens to Jonas and Mercy. Like we never see them die. We don't know what happens to them. They just kind of, the witch takes them and probably eats them or does something horrible, and it's left to the imagination, and that's great. But I do kind of feel like the script was at a certain point, it's like, all right, we need to kill all these families off, or all the family members off, how are we going to do that? And I think that Kate's death here is a little Michael Myers, like a little bit horror movie, and we'll see Anya Taylor-Joy, reaching to grab the knife, that's like just within range. It's like, I don't know. It's a little bit, again, I'm being ridiculous. This is such a nitpick, and I shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. This movie's awesome, but yeah, it does kind of strike me as maybe like a little bit slashery, a little bit kind of horror movie cliche. But this is a very sliding grading scale. It's because I know that like this director and like this team is like capable of like, is just like so top tier that this would be super forgivable in any other case. But And it is, but yeah, I just kind of feel like it's like it kind of slips into just kind of like horror movie cliches for just a second here, which I'm not a huge fan of. I do love how the mom here, Kate, like this is the first time we see her hair, where her hair's down like an unmarried woman, and and after she signed the Devil's Book in the Raven scene and stuff, and that's a nice little detail. Thank you everybody for the super chats. By the way, I apologize if I've been missing a few of them. Oh, interesting. Atun-Shei did New Orleans or Texas, San Diego, southern regions, Mexico, Latin America, blah, blah, see a witch hunt or panic based on voodoo or hoodoo? No is the short answer. That was not really. Yeah, that wasn't really a thing. Certainly not in the same way. And also by the time, you also kind of have to think that like by the time New Orleans was founded in 1718, right? This is solidly
long over.
Yeah, the trials are long over.
Although people were even in Spain, though, people were still being executed for things, witchcraft and stuff like that, even through the 18th century. Yeah, early on, the first and last execution for heresy was in Spain. The last one being in the 19th century. The first one was hanged for blasphemy in the 19th century in Spain.
Well, so nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, they're still lurking around over there. The Inquisition still exists, by the way, just FYI. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faithful is the rebranded Inquisition, and the former Pope was the head of it. Yeah, it still exists. It's just been rebranded as a Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faithful, but the Inquisition technically still exists. And also, by the way, there are always three of them. That had very specific functions. So the Inquisition was never the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, the Roman, and the General Inquisition all had very different functions. In fact, the Spanish Inquisition was a break on the witch trials in many ways. If you could be accused of witchcraft anywhere, it would be in Spain. That's where you want to be accused, because the Spanish Inquisition was a pretty strong. They had probably one of the strongest systems of an appellate system, where the evidentiary bar was actually pretty well established.
Interesting.
So yeah, anywhere there was a strong appellate system, the amount of trial, with the exception of the major Basque trial, that trial was incredibly brutal. But otherwise than that, Spanish trials were the Inquisition functioned as a break on the trials.
Interesting. Yeah, that's one of my kind of blind spots of my knowledge is the Spanish Inquisition.
Mostly was there to police conversos. It was there basically to make sure that Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity were really being Christian. So it was really mostly that, as opposed to hunting witches. So
yeah.
So it was a different creature to function differently, but it still had a massive surveillance system, still used torture, etc.
Yeah, for sure.
But
thanks, Casey.
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing how the witchcraft the trials happen differently in different places and different times, and seeing how it changes and how it moves, and seeing what kind of cultural baggage they bring to the trials. For instance, the familiars in the Anglo-Saxon world as opposed to other kinds of things. Flight, for instance, the debates over flight, which actually was interesting about this is that flight in this is sort of a bit of a weird thing, as we'll see in just a minute. But in the Scottish cases, flight to the Sabbath was really never a big deal. And like you mentioned earlier, in the Puritan imagination, they're not millions of witches in the same way. My favorite thing, actually, by the way, is a French witch trial where several witches confessed to going to Newfoundland to the Sabbath. They all went to Newfoundland.
I remember. I saw your video where you mentioned that. Yeah,
I love that. They all gather at Newfoundland.
Yeah, they all get at Newfoundland.
They're over there, and it's like always half past. I always listen to the Canadian. Well, I live in Detroit, so we get the Canadian broadcasting, and so you can find it at 10 o'clock or 10:30 in Newfoundland. I'm like, why are they half an hour ahead? So the witches are half an hour ahead in Newfoundland.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
The greatest line from the movie here.
Yeah, they're going to visit Lonso Meadows and celebrating Leif Erikson Day with a glass of mead. So now Thomasin is fulfilling her destiny by making covenant with the devil. So it's sort of it is interesting. I think there's a line from demonology that kind of speaks to kind of Thomason's journey here, which I doubt is an accident on Robert Eggers' part. But
No.
and I think this is something that I mentioned in one Witchfinder General video or another, where it's basically like there are a few types of people that God will permit the devil tempt into witchcraft, and one of them are some of the best, some of the most godly.
Right.
To test them before the world, as he did with Job. So, and I think that's very much Thomason's journey in this movie is that she is she begins as a good Puritan, very much her father's daughter, right? She sort of is that and then sort of to end at this place is very fitting in terms of Puritan theology. I do think so. We've got this very famous line.
It's the best line
coming up.
Wouldst thou like to butter, live, a pretty dress, and wouldst thou like to live deliciously and see the world? Again, this is the thing the devil can offer, right? I can show you the world, because that's what the devil controls. Exactly. And of course, the flight myth, by the way, it's all about the devil living in the air. That's where the Puritans and many other people thought the devil lived, was in the air. The air was controlled by the devil. And of course, we have the famous book here, where the devil requires
and live deliciously. See, I didn't actually realize this until I reread the Book of Revelation this summer. Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? That is a direct reference to the Book of Revelation. In fact, I thought it was significant enough that I pulled it up ahead of time. It's 18:7, and the line is speaking about the whore of Babylon here, and the line is, "How much she hath glorified herself and lived deliciously. So much torment and sorrow give her, for she saith in her heart, I sit a queen and am no widow, and shall say no sorrow." So
and you get the apocalyptic dimension here, right? That Thomason is playing a part in this apocalyptic end. That she may be, in fact, the whore of Babylon. Like
exactly, and very much that's shall see no sorrow. I mean, how much. Very, very fitting to Thomason's journey here. And actually, I do think it was a great, if you looked kind of closely at when Satan showed up, when Black Phillip transformed into sort of a human manifestation of Satan in that scene. If you kind of look closely, you see in that shot, there's a goat leg, and then it turns into a stirruped boot. And then when he appears behind Thomason, he's very much dressed in the Cavalier style, right? He's very much dressed like an aristocrat, like almost like Charles I, right? He's got a very fashionable kind of French cape. He's got a wide brimmed hat with a feather, and he's just very fashionable. And I think that's just a great, again, just like in terms of this being a Puritan nightmare, that's just so great that the devil dresses like King Charles, it's just such a great little tidbit, it also totally tracks. As a Puritan apologist myself, I completely agree that the Cavaliers were devilish. Yeah, nothing worse. No, I'm kidding. But
so the chanting here is actually a real thing. This is a real language. I put it in the chat. Cool. If you want to cut and paste it into the live chat. They're actually chanting in the so-called Enochian language, a language revealed to Dr. John D. Nelbert Kelly by the angels. And the chanting here is actually from the 11th call in the Enochian language. And if cut and paste into the live chat, folks can see that it's about flight. And so they're chanting in an actual occult language of the 16th century about being turned into a whirlwind, basically. And of course,
that's awesome.
So this requires a little bit of occult knowledge here, where you would just hear chanting if you didn't know it. But for the folks in the room who are a little more familiar with 16th century occultism, they're chanting in an actual occult language that has a very mysterious origin. And I've included both the Enochian angelic language and the English translation.
Great. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I copied and pasted it into the chat. It broke into a couple of things, but what a great tidbit. See, Justin, this is why you were the man to be here with this commentary. That is so cool. Like
it's a really
damn it,
cool
Robert
tidbit.
Eggers, you beautiful freaking bastard, dude. That is amazing. That's incredible.
So it's a cool tidbit. It's a part to me that's like, he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to really do the doubling down on the research, and then he produces this.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's amazing. Well, the movie's over. We can keep talking through the credits, of course. But so one thing that I did want to ask you about, Justin, like, again, sort of going off of our discussion about how a lot of Puritan ideas of witchcraft were actually like excuse me, a little bit boring in comparison to the Catholic and continental tradition.
Right.
I kind of feel like the naked women dancing around the fire is a little bit more Catholic. No, I mean that's a right.
Yeah,
That's
you don't
a
see this.
bit too sexy for New England.
It's also just a bit more continental in general. You don't really see it in England so much. The Sabbaths in England, and by the way, just a FYI, the term Sabbath never really occurs much in the main body of the witch literature. It probably gets picked up in the 20th century. It does occur a little bit in the French literature. We never see it in German literature, and we hardly ever see it in the English literature. But again, you also hear the anti-Semitic element, right? It's women going to the Sabbath. It's this sort of anti-church thing that they're doing. So, but yeah, the naked women, the orgies and stuff. Typically, those images would have primarily not been just women. It would have also been demons there. They'd have been having sex. And the most famous thing is they all dance backwards. So they would turn backwards and dance around a fire in reverse, not looking at each other. And I think it's also interesting, again, that the last image we see is Thomasine without the other witches there. That in some sense, the devil's also abandoned her. That she's promised a new family, basically. And when she's kind of resurrected or risen to the air, she's alone. So I think you do get the sense at the end that the devil has played he's played her too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that's another horrifying aspect of what's going on here, that she will not live deliciously.
Exactly. Well, and it's kind of, this is betraying my my age here. But you know, I don't know how many of you guys played Twisted Metal back in the day on PlayStation 1, but that reminds me a lot of Calypso in that game, a very satanic figure who everybody, you know, he hosts a competition of drive around in a car and kill everyone else who's driving around in a car, and it's all very schlocky and fun. But he basically will grant you anything that your heart desires, and it's heavily implied that he has supernatural kind of abilities. But he always turns it on its head, you know, and he always and you know, if you wish, oh, I want to be buried in cash, then he, you know, buries you in cash until you suffocate, you know, and there's always the final animation of the game was always, you know, something really
always
horrifying,
some monkey's paw stuff. Yeah, it's always the
monkey's paw stuff. Exactly,
yeah, it's always
exactly.
monkey's paw. Yeah, man, the devil works like that too. It's always monkey's paw.
Precisely. Yeah, it is, and that's always kind of the devil's. You know, is that he kind of he gets off on it. He loves that stuff, that he can trick people and lie to them about this stuff.
Right.
You know,
of course. Yeah. This is why also, like, people, like, you know, again, there's so many of these characters. You know, the devil becomes sort of the trickster god in Christianity.
Totally.
Kind of a Loki figure.
Absolutely. Good point.
And so. But yeah, that last image, again, that last chanting with them quoting all this Enochian stuff, to me really cements this film and is a really cool way of talking. And John Dee also deserves a movie. Why he's not like in his own movie blows my mind. Because that's just a super interesting world where he's talking to angels and engaging in espionage and swapping his wife because the angels tell him to, and rebuking the Holy Roman Emperor and all this. That's wonderful, crazy stuff. But yeah, you know, again, I think one of the things I'd love to see a movie do, and I don't know if anyone's ever watching this stuff that ever cares about what people like me think, but
I mean, honestly, though, seriously though, Justin, like, I would be frankly surprised if Robert Eggers didn't watch your YouTube channel. He probably thinks that I'm a poser, but I'm like, you know, I'd be shocked if he didn't at least know of you, considering his interests.
Yeah, maybe so. You know, and again, my what I would implore is, you know, we have so much good information about this stuff now. Like the scholarship, the level of scholarship is so good, and that's part of why I started my channel, was that so much of the scholarship is there. It's just not reaching a broad audience, because so much of it's locked away, and you know, it's locked away in people having access to stuff like this, you know, a book from 1574, who read Latin and things like that. And luckily I can read Latin. I can have access to stuff, and producing this content where it says, look, we're not doomed to dopey stories about witches. We can really get into the trial records and really get into the witch hunter manuals and really get into that world, the way that you get into the world of the Puritans. And by getting into the world of the Puritans, or getting into the world of these witch hunters, or these occultists or whatever, we realize they're people, and they realize that they're rich and textured and complex. And there's just so much going on there that while I think that this movie is a really great movie, I really would love to see a movie that takes on witchcraft and the witch hunts from a historical perspective,
Mm.
where it is basically a pan-European conspiracy theory that killed 60,000 women.
Yeah.
And there were skeptics the entire time who were
Yeah.
lampooned as crazy
Yeah.
people, and they were lampooned as not Christians. They were like, "Oh,
Mhm.
you don't believe in this? You're not Christian."
Mhm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it would be, I think that would be, to me, would part of what would be a really fascinating film would be to have a film where the witch trials are raging and where the skeptics, the minority skeptics who we knew were right the
Mhm.
entire time,
Yeah.
have to contend with the overwhelming machine of the state, which was bent
Yeah.
on
Yeah. Yeah.
killing these women.
Yeah.
And then show
Yeah.
these women, show mentally ill women, show poor
Mm.
women, show women who can't read and write, show women being strapatoed, and show what this really looked like, and be
Yeah.
like, this is the gutter of conspiracy theory thinking. It's
Yeah.
an illiterate, mentally
Absolutely.
ill woman at the end of a strapato being forced to tell her friends' names.
Yeah.
So I
And
think that
really, there hasn't been that. I mean, that's amazing. And I mean, yes, Justin, like I would, it's not just the White Claw talking. Like, if you wanted to write a screenplay about that very topic, I'm your man.
hey, look,
Uh,
I can tell you, man, I would love to work with you on it.
yeah,
If we could,
absolutely.
even a
This is
single
my bread and
act.
butter.
Yeah, even a single
Yeah.
act, I think would
Yeah.
be just to, again, to show this, and also just to show some of these witch hunters as bumblers. They basically buy a copy of
Mm.
Malice Maleficarum for 10 silver coins, and now they read it, and now they're witch hunters.
I mean, yeah, like Matthew Hopkins.
Yeah,
Like, I mean,
he was just some guy.
yeah, he was just a guy, and he was also like 24.
Yeah, he was just some
Like
guy,
he was a child. He was a
yeah.
kid.
And he would walk into a
yeah.
village and say things like, "Is anything going bad here?" And I'm
Yeah,
like, "It's the
yeah,
17th century. What are you talking about?"
exactly. Things are
Did
definitely
anyone
going bad.
recently die weirdly? Like, did crops fail? I'm like, "What are you
Yeah,
talking about?"
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. No, for sure. Yeah, that's amazing. And the mental illness is, like, I feel like a really, like, interesting element of it, because yeah, I mean, if you are, if you are mentally ill, and so many of us, I mean, we can only kind of conceive of the world to a certain extent, I mean, within our own cultural context.
Mhm.
And if
Of
you
course.
are a mentally ill person in 17th century Europe, and you have these things that are happening to you, and this perception of reality that your brain, that your sick brain is doing, what other explanation is there but that the
Yeah.
devil
The
is,
devil is afflicting you.
afflicting
You're
me,
possessed, or yeah.
and that I'm possessed, and that would be a really, interesting sort of dynamic to explore in a film, and that hasn't been done before. Like, we've
No.
seen The Crucible, and we've seen sort of the McCarthyist sort of,
Right.
allegory of witchcraft, and that's been, kind of done to death. I mean, it's great. I mean, Crucible's a classic play, and the Daniel Day-Lewis adaptation is
It's fantastic.
that's
Anything Daniel
amazing.
Day-Lewis touches, isn't it?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
pure gold. But yeah, no, that's
But to
that
see the
has never really
development
been
of
done.
melancholia, to see that melancholia as our enthusiasm too, right, which is its opposite. To see that
Mhm.
these concepts of melancholia and enthusiasm with people like Johann Weyer, Johann Weyer, folks may know, is the student of Cornelius Agrippa, who was the author of the 3 books of occult philosophy. He was the single greatest systematizer of occult magical philosophy in early modern Europe, Renaissance Europe. And Agrippa famously defended a woman against witchcraft and won. He actually won her acquittal, and he was exiled from the city after he did it. And so again, I just feel like there's so much period drama stuff to be done that speaks to modernity, speaks to now, speaks to conspiracy theories, speaks to the power of again, we typically think of medieval people, early modern people, as not reasonable, but they were eminently reasonable given the constraints of their world. And so,
Yeah.
again,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
really admire them, and I admire their wisdom, and I feel like that so much could be done at the historical level to mine those lessons out, so we could, there's a whole learning from the past thing. I
Yeah.
keep hearing about that, but I don't see much of it.
Yeah, no, not really. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, the conspiracy mindset. Yeah, you're right. I mean, and we have, like, we've been touching on this, but yeah, just this, like, um, uh, yeah, it really is one of those things where, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Mhm.
Where it's like, I mean, it is such a, and I don't mean to keep kind of harping on this, but the QAnon stuff, and
Yeah.
just, killing babies, drinking babies' blood. Like it's just that's what it comes down to, and it's elemental. It's this elemental European mythology, which as we touched upon, very sadly has its roots in anti-Semitism, and we should absolutely, at least in my opinion, kind of call that stuff out for what it is.
Yeah, sure.
Mixed with very real concerns about sort of the elites of society, or sort of the sort of domination by I guess, the rich or whatever, without getting kind of necessarily too political about it. But this is what happens when you have 3 White Claws. Yeah, sort of that kind of, but those conspiracy theories that develop in that way. I mean, it does, it is sort of that old thing that is also informed by the context of the time, and that was certainly the fact with or the case with the elaborated theory of witchcraft, where like so much of it was kind of wrapped up in the culture and the politics of the time.
Right.
And it is sort of, somebody said QAnon lemon scented anti-Semitism. No, I didn't. There it is. Lemon scented anti-Semitism. Yeah. Basically.
No, again, nothing new under the sun. Nothing new.
Yeah,
I mean,
nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun. And so, nothing new under the sun. And so when I see these things, I try to think through like, oh, this is why I'm really interested in the witch trials. It's not because it's quote Bill Faulkner, my countryman. The famous Bill Faulkner quote: "The past isn't dead; it's not even past."
Well, Bill Faulkner, if all of us Southerners can imagine what it would be like to be on that field at 3 p.m. on July the 3rd.
I hear my entire history narrated by Shelby Foote. I do tell people this. I swear to God that if some people say, there are people sometimes affect the British accent because they want to be Madonna or whatever. And I tell, of all the accents I wish I could be born with, it would have been the Shelby Foote accent. That sort of
the guy had a great
aristocratic
voice. The guy had a great voice.
That's sort of classic. But it's the Bill Faulkner quote's not wrong. I think the past isn't dead. When I look through the Malleus Maleficarum, when I'm touching a book from 1574, it doesn't take much to reach out to 8chan and be like, oh yeah, this is just Malleus Maleficarum being written by a bunch of toadstools, or whatever.
Totally, man. Totally.
Yeah, so it's not quite as good Latin, but
yeah, no, that's for sure. Now, definitely not as learned, but it's a similar sort of blunt idiocy.
Something like that.
For sure. I mean, so I think like, any kind of final thoughts? I guess we're kind of firmly into our post-film discussion now. But I mean, any thoughts about sort of the movie and sort of like, or any kind of, I guess, closing statements, as it were,
defend Thomasine.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that what's powerful about The Witch in the film, and also the idea that has maintained, how many witches I saw tonight out trick-or-treating with my kids, is it's just how this idea has landed in our society as both as a sort of object of terror, but I think what's really cool about it, and this is what gets us into the modern Wicca, sort of the redemption of the witch. And I think the redemption of the witch will actually prove to be a far longer arc than the condemnation of the witch. And of course, they who laugh last laugh best. Is that that these societies just didn't know what to do with some of these people at the edges of their society.
Yeah.
And because they didn't know what to do with them, they easily could fall victim to this kinds of persecution. 60,000 women, this is no small number.
Huge number. Yeah.
It's a huge number. Of course, over the space of a couple hundred years. And so for me, what I always wonder about is who's at the edge of society now that we're also in the process of demonizing.
Sure.
And whether it's mentally ill people, whether it's disabled people, whether, there's a whole range of people that for me, what I worry about is how, again, we go to the QAnon stuff. It's just how the stuff has survived.
Yeah.
And when I see little girls walking down the street as a witch and they feel empowered to be a witch because they have magical powers, that feels great. And I'm like, great, little, women and girls who are empowered by these ideas are great. And that's fantastic. But then I see the darker side of it, and which is Democrats eating adrenochrome, and I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
these
yeah,
ideas
yeah.
haven't gone away.
Yeah, they really have
So,
not. Yeah, yeah.
and so the only thing I worry about this movie, and this is where I want to say where I guess I want to end, is the only thing I worry
Mm,
about this movie is that folks who see it, and many people did, and it's a
mm,
movie worth seeing, is it reinforces the idea there really were witches in the woods.
mm.
There weren't.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
witches existed in the minds of the torturers, and
yeah.
they found them in the torture. They never found them. No, there's not a single case where someone says, I was riding through the forest and I came upon a Sabbath.
Yeah.
Never a single case of that ever happening. So the worry I have about these kinds of films, and again, I want to buzzkill or whatever, but the worry I have is that
No,
it
sure,
reinforces
sure.
the idea that there really were witches in the forest,
Yeah.
and they
Well,
weren't.
and you know, and speaking kind of from what I do, I mean, it's all, you know, it's all very fun when I kind of lampoon a lot of these ideas for comedy and in my videos and the Witchfinder General stuff. And I think, you know, I think it's pretty clear to anybody who has their thinking cap on that, you know, that kind of what I'm doing is satirizing
Right.
these ideas and not supporting them. But yeah, I think it is important that even as we sort of think, oh, you know, these crazy witch hunters and all their weird beliefs, that, you know, these were real people who were
Mhm.
killed, who were hanged, who were burnt at the stake, who, you know, and you know, and especially, you know, I mean, we're two dudes, you know, we don't
Sure.
know what it's like to be a woman, but I think it is like, you know, with kind of the you know, just being a woman in the world, you know, in the Western world, it's like, you know, not always the easiest thing. And I think that's sort of an element to this that is really important, is just the sheer sexism of a lot of the stuff. Not that all witches were women, of course, but the vast majority.
No, right. Right.
And yeah, no, I think that's a really I think that's always like an important thing to remember, is, you know, is that like, even though we're separated by 300 or 400 years, you know, this was still, you know, a large amount of innocent people who were murdered, you know, and it was a mass murder, and it is a very sort of somber thing. And I do think that, like, and I don't mean this, you know, as sort of as an insult, but I do think, and I think there's like a place for this for sure, but I do think that it is also like a very Eurocentric movie, and not that it's a bad thing. That's what it's going for. It's going for, this is a Puritan having a nightmare, right? You
Right.
know, this is from firmly from the Puritan perspective, and you know, I think I don't think it like goes about that Eurocentric viewpoint, you know, tastelessly. I think it's very tasteful. I think it's very
Of course, I agree.
considerate, you know, and I don't think it is, and I think it's very considered, and I think that it isn't uh, sort of a bad thing. I mean, I think Robert Eggers did a great job with this on pretty much every level. But yeah, I mean, it's you know, kind of what I mentioned very early on in the stream was that, you know, sort of Native Americans are notably absent, right?
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
the wilderness is the domain of Satan, and from a perspective of Puritan, like, that makes total sense. But also, you know, from a purely historical perspective and in terms of historical accuracy, you know, that was, you know, this wasn't an untamed wilderness. This was very much
A
a
highly maintained
this
area.
was a
Yeah,
highly maintained
yeah,
natural area, you
yeah.
know,
I'm sure the Native
and
Americans are peeking out through the forest, being like, "Those white people are
yeah,
crazy.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Why are they doing this?"
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And so, you know, and it is interesting, like, you know, like, there's some, and again, I'm probably going to horribly misquote this or misremember it, so I apologize to everybody. But I seem to remember reading something that John Smith wrote about Virginia, where he was like, he was going through the woods of Virginia with on his horse at a gallop, because it was an orchard. It was like an apple orchard or something that he was riding through. It was a very consciously maintained area that was
Hmm.
very specific to harvesting fruit off of these trees. So, you know, it was specifically had been was flat. It was the trees were like spaced far apart. Like, it was very specifically like cultured in order to provide sustenance to these native nations. And like, and of course, you know, from the European perspective at the time, you know, kind of famously, and this sort of the you know, this will be news to no one in the chat. I mean, this is sort of a well-known thing, but you know, that sort of Europeans thought that they were approaching this wilderness and coming to this virgin continent, but in fact, it was simply just, it was highly evolved and highly settled, obviously depopulated by disease, but even so, it was still kind of had been maintained according to the needs of the cultures that were there.
Right.
And certainly this is something that, you know, when we put our sort of history caps on, that we definitely need to acknowledge when we kind of want to dive into the Puritan mindset, and we want to put our kind of like Halloweeny horror movie caps on and sort of kind of take the witch as a Puritan nightmare. Then of course, you know, from their perspective, it is this sort of satanical, magical wilderness, this
Right.
kind of Grimm's fairy tale, black forest type of place. So yeah, so that's all sort of very interesting things that that the movie brings up. And yeah, again, I don't want it to come across like I'm shitting on the movie, because I got nothing but respect for the
No,
people who did this,
absolutely.
and I think it's a great movie. But yeah, it's just interesting to talk about from a historical perspective, and we're all history nerds, we all get it.
Yep.
But yeah, so well, damn it, Justin, this has been more fun than a barrel of monkeys on crack, and
Damn, that's a lot of fun.
and,
a lot too much fun
yeah.
for a Sunday night, but
and yeah, so I guess we can wrap it up.
yeah,
But yeah, Justin, thank you so much for being a part of this. I really appreciate you coming by, and thank you everybody for tuning in, and I hope a lot of you are watching along. Atun-Shei coming across a bit manic. When do I not? Says PS, right? Yeah, but I definitely appreciate it. And I just want to wish you all a very happy Halloween. Stay spooky, everybody. And yeah, and I really hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, Justin, let's should we do the lighthouse next?
Hey man, I'm all about the Robert Eggers Spooky Film Fest. I'm all about yeah, man, I'd love to work together on more stuff, and both on the filmmaking side where you have a lot of expertise, and also just, hey man, if I can sit down with cool folks like you and watch scary movies and talk about the elaborated theory of witchcraft for an hour and a half, it's coming up Millhouse. So
yeah, yeah, exactly. All right, well then I'll end things, but yeah, thank you everybody so much for
thank you guys so much
for tuning in, and yeah, please don't forget, go over to Esoterica, Justin's channel, and subscribe. Let's get above 100,000, baby. All right, everybody, happy Halloween. See you later. Adios.